Right, so ons gebruik baie keer hierdie, so wat ons noem die wasmasjien, jy gooi goed hier aan die bokant in by initial demand wat jou plans, jou config, jou network en so aan is, en dan hardloop hierdie ding deur en dan spoeg hy hooplik vir jou iets skoon uit aan die ander kant. En dit kan pretty intimidating wees. So ek dink in die afloop wat ek vanmiddag wil doen is om vir julle self te leer, at least in hierdie konteks, om jou lewe hooplik 'n bietjie makliker te maak. Maybe some of it you use, some of it you don't. Right. So there's a specific figure that I just need to find in the document. Just bear with me. If you didn't pick up, this is the MATSim book that I'm kind of scrolling through. Also here. Ek soek spesifiek die ene wat daai so wasmasjien het, maar met die hakpunte. I can probably search, but I don't know what words are. No, those are plug-in points. Maybe they've just fixed this already. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Input data preparation, not that.
Just 620 pages. Only 500 pages altogether.
Oh. This is the MATSim, traffic signals, blah, 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 network implementation and traffic flow. Okay, now this is too far, so they've probably taken out that picture. Let's use the best we have. All right. So it is possible to do a whole bunch of or connect into all of this. So what we've done in the past is we do a lot of the data gymnastics outside, and eventually by the time that you hit the controller.run, it is so darn messy that you can't follow your own code, because all of the coding happens outside of the actual MATSim process. But what there actually is, and that's the figure that I'm missing, is there are a bunch of places along the way where MATSim specifically listens to. So there is a thing that's called a startup listener. So you've heard about events. So we've got two levels of events. We've got events that gets generated in the mobility simulation, and those we just kind of refer to as normal events. Link enter, link leave, person get out of his car, person starts activity, end of activity, all of those kind of events. That's kind of generated by the mobility simulation, the execution. But there's a second level of event that says, do something for me at startup. Do something for me before the MATSim. Do something for me after the MATSim, but before the scoring. Do something before scoring, after scoring. Before replanning, after replanning. So there's a whole bunch of different places where you get to actually intervene and say, but while you're here, do something for me quickly. And I think that will, in a lot of your projects, help you to engage with this piece of machinery in a lot more cleaner way. All right, so what I want to do now is not tell you what to do at those hook points, but just show you where they actually are. All right. I probably need first things first. Follow the same structure. This is actually what I want. Copy that. That's not what I wanted. So now I should have roughly the same structure as what you have inside your BPJ folders, where there's a code folder with the MATSim example project. So let's go to BPJ and say file. Next, MATSim example project. What I probably need here is just right. New Java class, run MATSim with logs. Right, I want a final private static logger called log is logger dot get logger, and this is called run MATSimLogs.class none. And then I need what is it? Public static void main method. And then I want my header. It's still resolving the dependencies, so it's not there yet. Okay, so we can add that just now. Sorry?
What's the function of the header?
Just to give me, to tell me what class I'm running with what arguments. It's just my standard way of starting a main method. Okay, so I want to start a MATSim controller and I want to get the thing to actually run. So I say I want a scenario. I create a scenario with the scenario utils, and I create a config using config utils dot create config. New controller. There's only MATSim stuff that is spelled wrong, so that's fine. New controller. Mind you, I say controller. Controller is new controller, and I give it the scenario and controller dot run. Right, so this part we've done, and this part is also available inside this run MATSim portion. So that's pretty much the same as what I've done, which is the absolute basics. So you could have probably just used that if you want to as well. So I'm going to take those. Hello test thing is out. And the MATSim GUI for now. I don't really need that. Right. Oops. That I want to refactor and I want to move it. I want it inside. Come on. Not to package, but to BBJ. So there it is. Okay. And now I should have my header. Header MATSim dot print header. It wants the class name and the arguments. So the class name is run MATSimLogs dot class, and I pass it the arguments, and in the end I just run my footer. Okay, so we know that by default the controller is set up so that it runs 1,000 iterations. I want to just fix two things. So controller dot no, I can't seem to get my hands on it. Probably get the config.controller.set overriding file settings, and I want to delete the directory if it already exists. So otherwise it keeps on crashing me if crashing on me if I run the same code and the output folder already exists. And then I want to get the config also in the controller, set the last iteration to 5 for practical purposes. Right. So if I run this, I should actually have something that executes. Probably garbage, because there's nothing much really in there. There's my header. It starts running. Something's happening, and there's a bunch of info. I get the MATSim shutdown stuff. Okay, there's a problem, and I get done. What is the problem here? It wants to write It wants to write output events, but there are no events in the 5th iteration. So I probably have to make that 10, or I have to set my events to be written every 5 iterations. Let's keep it simple and do that. So I say controller dot get config dot controller dot set write events interval every 5 iterations. So I guess what you see when I code is also, I don't know where these things are. I've got a rough idea that I need to set the iterations, and I have an idea, but I've seen this in the config file, therefore it's probably somewhere in the config. So this code completion pretty much help you to learn what functionality is available to you and what not. Right. So this now should at least run. I think the biggest message, kind of take-home message for me, yep, and there it is. The biggest take-home message for me today is you have to always have something that runs. From the word go. If you're going to embark on a 2-month period of coding this heck of an algorithm and implementation, and hope that you will debug the thing come the time that you hit the run button, it's just not going to work. MATSim is going to kill your spirit in that sense. It's just way too overwhelming, and in that washing machine you've got absolutely no idea what the heck is going on. All right. So, I think in all of your in all of your cases, I say all, I don't mean yours necessarily, you've probably either seen or seen example code where something like the following happens. Controller.add overriding module, new abstract module. Bloop. Have you seen anything in any of the code like this?
I've seen an override method.
Right? The override method.
Yeah.
What this does, it tells this controller, remember the controller is the thing that looks after the washing machine. It tells the controller, I want to add some more functionality in here. And that might be writing my specific statistics to file, read something at a specific point. So now you're adding a module, but you're kind of doing it in line. And very quickly, this main method of yours becomes 600 lines of code that you cannot navigate anymore. And it becomes really pretty horrific. Right. So, what can we do about that? I think Kai Nagel at some point said, no class should have more than 200 lines of code. Otherwise, it's not tractable anymore. Now, I cannot stick, or I usually forget about that advice by the time that I get so excited about coding. But I think there's a lot of value in there. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new class for myself here called, no, it needs to be a new Java class.
When you're creating that, I'm just trying to keep it the consequence of how we've been working in the same code folder in the repository. We have the example and our run. We deleted the GUI package.
Folder, yeah, that's fine. It was just the stuff that comes standard with MATSim's example project.
Yeah, you're not creating the class just in the org MATSim.
Yeah, that's kind of the parent folder.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I don't necessarily know what the naming convention is of calling these packages, but you'll often see it's org.something. If you download open source from another project, it might be org.this. For the Swiss Railways, I think, is something like org.sbb or something. So the org typically tells you, is it commercial? If it's commercial, it will be com. So I'll be honest, I don't quite know, so I just stick with the org.matsim because it tells me it's got something to do with MATSim. Yours might be org.up.something if you want. Right. So I'm going to create a new class. Your options here are you can have a class, you can have an interface, you can have a variety of different things. I'm going to call this my module. And what this module is going to do, and you probably read about these things called inheritance in your Java kind of introduction. So you have a class, and a class can inherit from parent stuff. So this abstract module is actually, if I say command and I click on that, it will actually take me into the MATSim code that I'm dependent on, and it'll take me to that class. And here I can actually see this is a public abstract class. And what that means, an abstract module already inherits from a module. What is a module? A module is the rawest interface, and there you can read a module contributes blah 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 blah. Somebody wrote it. Who wrote it? Probably Kai Nagel or Marcel Rieser. Right. So that's the highest level, an interface. So in MATSim there's this thing called a module. It's very abstract. Then you get an abstract module, which is already pretty abstract, but it adds a little bit more functionality. And now you get an idea, wow, there's a lot of this stuff about MATSim listener, snapshot writer, event handler, controller listener, and a whole bunch of other things. All right, so this abstract module is what we will be kind of dealing with. So when I write my module, I'm simply going to say I want to implement this thing called an abstract module. And immediately there will be error messages that says, wait, you can't just do that. You either have to implement the methods, or you have to change your own module to say, but it's not a public class anymore, it's an abstract class, meaning you can't instantiate one of these things. So the only method that I have to implement is install. And this is not necessarily all that smart, but it's not implements, because otherwise that must be an interface. So this is extends properly. Yeah, then it's happy. Right. So you probably need to delve into the machinery to understand when is this abstract module actually being called. All right? What does it actually do? Yep.
Can you show us how you installed it again?
How?
Where did we click off the...
Okay, so sorry, I do a lot of... Okay, so I'm there, and that was... Okay, so I started by typing this. Now, the shortcut key in IntelliJ is Option Enter. Whenever you're on an error like this, these kind of red squiggly marks, can you just switch off? Somebody just help me watch the time when it's 10 to 2. 5 to is also fine. I just need to run downstairs. Right.
And that little menu pops up if you say command.
Yeah, so if I say command enter, option enter, and I don't know what it is on a Windows machine, it's probably alt enter.
Yeah.
Alt enter tells you or gives you suggestions in terms of what can you possibly do to fix this. It says, okay, you can either change implement to extends, which is actually what I want to do. Okay, cool, I've done that. Oops, there's still an error. I do it again. And now it says, but hey, there are methods that you have to implement. And I simply say, implement those methods. In order for me to have a class my module, there must be some methods implemented. And that's the idea of the abstract, of implementing or extending an abstract class. All right.
Mine says avoid config and avoid install. So I want abstract module, and so change implements to extends.
And again, implement the method. Yeah. Just say, okay. Done.
Just a little bit different.
Okay, yours says configure abstract module.
And install. Must it be the same or is it not matter?
No, it should be this. You picked the wrong abstract module. You've got the Google inject. I want to extend MATSim's core one. So just delete that import statement and yeah, so the more dependencies you have, the more of these different kind of ecosystem of classes and libraries it will try and pick up.
So we want to add more functionality to an existing module called abstract.
Yes.
Module.
Yeah. So now we're going to say it's no longer an abstract module. It's got to be a real module called my module.
Oh, so we're overwriting the name as well.
Yeah. So we actually say we had this thing called an abstract module. Now we're saying we add more functionality by extending it, and this new thing that we create is called my module. Done. All right. So to really show you what I try to kind of do here is and show you kind of this in action is to say, whoops, I've actually got no idea what I'm dealing with here. Right, so I'm creating this module, but I don't know when when install is called, what is calling install, where does this actually feature into the whole MATSim thing. So I'm creating a final private static logger for myself. Oops. Called log.
The logger is the Apache one.
Yes, the log4j. And that's the only reason why I use MATSim example project for whatever stuff I want to code in Java as the base, because the smart people have already set up log4j and it's available. And that logging system to me is invaluable in coding Java. Right. So logger.getLogger, and I want to talk about my module oops, not empty module dot class. All right, and now what I do literally is inside this install method, I just write myself a log message. What can go wrong? Hey, this is where install is called. And by the way, I want to see this easily, so I'm going to throw it as a warning and not as normal text, because normal info gets written out like this, and a warning will be written red or an error. All right. So now I save. I go back to my run MATSim with logs, and I take out this kind of garbage called new abstract module, and I just instantiate my own my module. Voila. So I created a class called my module. I create a new item now, and I add it to the controller. And when this is called, I don't know when it is called. That's what I want to kind of try and figure out. When it is called, it will the install method, it will at least show me that. So I run my code. If it breaks, so what? I haven't lost anything. It runs to completion, and I go back and I check what the heck is going on. And there it is. Cool.
So instead of writing that new one module code in the original run MATSim with logs class, you wrote it in a different class and you just called it.
Sorry, say again?
Instead of writing that my module code in the run MATSim with logs, you write it in the
I create a separate class, and I just create that class here. Now my code is a lot simpler. So I might call this set up my experiment is the calling of my class, and when I call it, it sets up all of the stuff. But now what will happen is it will happen inside MATSim, not outside with my own code. It happens inside MATSim, and hopefully it will actually be a lot simpler, because ultimately what I want to get to is that we write code with a one-click solution. You run one click and it does all the magic inside the code. If there's a problem, it gets checked with your unit tests, with your integration tests. Voila, you've got clean code, and you don't have things kind of buggering around. All right.
Why is there why is the code printed for
I have no idea. And I've picked this up in some of the code that I'm running. And this is where it was a design choice a couple of years ago, probably 3-4 years ago at the developer meeting. They introduced this what they call Google Juice, which actually it literally is a case of, and I probably have something like this that says, okay, here I have a MATSim scenario. Okay? I created it. I read it in, it's there. What we typically do is whenever we create these things, we pass it on as an argument. You create a class, you pass on the argument, you say, all right, here's your scenario, and the class knows when I'm created, I get the scenario, I store it as a private variable, and then I can use it whenever I need it. Right? When inside that you create another class, you pass it on again. So there's a very explicit trial. What Google Juice does is it says, you've got a scenario. Okay, there it is. Somewhere, all of this huge amounts of code, you can inject the scenario. And whoops, it will just pluck it from the air, provided that there is a scenario already loaded and thrown into the air. So this is really an abstract idea to kind of grasp. But that's the nature. That's how modern coding is that's a Java thing. That's not a MATSim thing. MATSim just decided to follow what the good coding stuff actually is. It makes for more efficient code, but it reduces readability. And it becomes pretty hard, and you'll see that as we go on. Okay, so you're comfortable with the idea of kind of creating your own module. Now, you don't have these little locks on your side. If you wanted,
Sorry, which ones?
these little green images on yours, you probably don't. If you want to, I can just show you how to get it. That's what I want to get to next, but if I just want to switch them on, I think it might be good practice to just switch them on. It tells you whether this class is visible from the outside or not. It tells you whether something you've probably heard about, classes that are private, classes that are package protected, and classes that are public.
Where was that now?
That was under Help, under Edit Custom VM Options, and then you add this last line. All it does, IntelliJ as such is also written in Java. So when you create IntelliJ, it just gives you, or you have the opportunity to add more arguments to the Java virtual machine at startup. And at some point you just have to shut down IntelliJ and open it up again to actually see the effect, but we can just carry on for now, as long as it's set up. Can we continue? Done? So I think the MATSim example project works on MATSim 0.10.1, which is a pretty, old, it's last year's version, but it's the latest stable version. I'm pretty excited in terms of what's happening in the 0.11 version, but just because I start to realize what the value is of knowing public versus private methods. And the idea originally, or the trigger was that MATSim is really hard, and I mean most of you know that by now. It's hard to engage with it because you don't know, should I create a new class? Should I bind it? Should I inject it? There are so many different ways of getting the same stuff done. There's coord utils.create coordinate, or there is a new coord impl. Which one should I use? What's the right one? What's the impact of what? And what MATSim is now doing is the footprint of the code is being reduced. And that simply means is there are fewer and fewer of these public methods available. So hopefully soon there will be one. If you want to create a coordinate, there's only one way of doing it. So you don't have things that can actually go wrong in so many different ways. And I want you, when you write code, to think about that consciously as well. To decide, what do I really want an external user to be able to get their hands on? And if it's something that I use in my code internally, make it at least package protected. If it needs something in another class in the same package, in the same folder, you make it package protected. So that's what I'm going to do for now. Modules is probably a little bit unique. Modules is something that you very often have public because you want anybody to create this freestanding module of yours and it will do all the magic. So that is probably usually public. But we can, for example, say just option enter, and you can say, yes, I want to make this package private. And all it does, it takes the public away, and suddenly you've got a little gray circle there that says, this is only visible from within this package. Not even from the GUI package, only available inside the BPJ package. Right. And I think the same for your code as well. You want to keep the things, the algorithms and the solution stuff, you want to keep that as the footprint as small as possible, that from the outside there must just be a new query algorithm and whatever kind of setup it is. Right. Good. Now I actually want to get to the other stuff. Okay, so what goes private, public, package? Try to make it package protected and private as far as possible. But yeah, so that would just be the guidance. But there's no recipe for that. I think it depends on your code and your code design. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to create a new class. And I'm going to call this all my controller listeners. And I'm going to start by making this package private as well. So now I just want to demonstrate that there are these different hooks that you kind of can get hold of throughout the MATSim run. Now, to just start off with, I think you can actually say implements. And I don't know what all the controller listeners are. So the controller listeners are these special events that are available that works with the MATSim washing machine. I know of one, and it's called the startup. Okay, it's clearly not called the startup listener. MATSim services, controller.
Maybe just use capital S for startup.
There you go, thank you. Startup listener. So I'm going to implement the startup listener. It imports it automatically, and I get my help function, and it says you either have to make this abstract or implement the methods that must be implemented. I want to implement the methods, and the method is notify startup. So what do I get? I get a startup event. Right.
So
Now,
automatically detects the stuff it needs to implement.
exactly, yeah. So because I say I want to implement it, it goes to startup listener and it says, this is an interface. It already extends a controller listener, and there's a method that is notified startup, but there's no method here, which means you have to implement it. If you want to implement this interface, you have to tell me what this method will look like, but it must always be called notify startup. In there, you can do whatever you want. All right, so here's a startup listener, and there is a controller listener. it extends the controller listener. Let's keep it simple for now. Go back to all my controller listeners. And here I also for myself want to create a logger. Final, private, static, logger. Log is logger dot get logger all my controller listeners dot class. So I create a logger for each one of my classes. Otherwise, I will not know what class is actually creating these log messages for me when it actually runs. Right. And all I'm doing here now is I say log.warn, and I say this is where my startup listener is called.
So you need to see where those little looks are before you.
Exactly. And you can do that anywhere in your code. But the cool thing, well, okay, sorry, I haven't linked all of this yet. So in my module in my controller will say, here's an overriding module. And as part of this controller, I want to add all of my controller listeners. But that's what I created the class for, all of my controller listeners. So this is where install is called, and then I'm also going to say add controller listener binding. And this is literally a case of, I have a class, it's called all my controller listeners. I'm just going to throw it in the air, and at some point when the controller wants it, it will get them. And it will know that all my controller listeners currently, that's where it will find the startup listeners and stuff. Okay, so how do you add this? You add a controller listener binding to, and you've got an option. Either you can bind something to a class or to an actual instance. When a class, when an instance, that's kind of still a little bit of black magic to me, but an instance is only if you actually have to create an object and pass it some very specific arguments. Then you could, here have to create an instance and say bind it to this particular instance. But the following two things will currently give us exactly the same thing. If I say I want to bind the controller listener to all my controller listeners dot class.
Sorry, was that now that to the key one or the class one?
Doesn't really matter. It will pick up that I pass it a class, so it will say, okay, so I guess you mean you pass it to the class. And again, this is the little bit trickier part, dealing with this abstract Google Juice stuff where you just throw stuff in the air and hope it doesn't fall on the ground. All right. So currently, if I go to all my controller listeners, I don't have a constructor. All right, it's not. I cannot create one. The question is, do I want to create one? If I really don't, I don't want anybody to be able to say new all my controller listeners. Then what I have to do is I have to say private all my controller listeners. I have to create a private constructor. Then it's physical and it's got an empty constructor. That essentially means, sorry, is it private void? I think it is. Or is it just private? I can't remember what the constructor actually looks like. Is there a shortcut? No. Probably check how you create it. Okay, so if you don't want anybody else to create an instance of this thing, then you'll make it private. And then what happens is, if I'm in my module, it's physically not possible to say all my controller listeners is new all my controller listeners. It will complain and it will tell you you have to make it package private or protected or public, because otherwise I cannot call this because it's currently private. All right, so you can do that if you want to. What I would suggest in a case like this is that for what I want to do now, I want to make it package private, because the only thing that will call all my controller listeners is the module, and it's in the same package, so I don't want anybody else to actually get hold of it. So I created, kind of make it package private, and if I now go to that class of mine, it just changed it and said there's a constructor, there's no private or public method, it's just the way it is. That's it. Right. So now I've done the binding. I said, well, in this case, I've created a new one. So let's just leave that as it is. I'm not doing anything with this object that I've created. My controller listener binding currently is to the class itself. So this is using the inject methodology. So if I now run it, my entire class, I would hope to see a message somewhere there. This is where my startup listener is called. So the entire startup procedure of MATSim takes up quite a bit of the initial stuff. All of this, you'll actually see if you kind of look at it, it has to do with this Google inject. So there's a lot of things in MATSim that is also injected and bound to the controller. And all of them gets called first. So MATSim does its normal machinery, and that is why what you're doing is you adding another binding to it. And that is why when we look at our run MATSim with logs, we add an overriding module. And that name has been chosen specifically to say, whatever you add now, know that you might be overwriting some of the other stuff that MATSim is already using. And if you mess it up, kind of your fault. All right. So that's why it kind of appears very low down. Right at the top, this is where our module is actually being called and installed. But then there's a whole bunch of other things that actually happens and injects. There's all your event handlers, your events to legs, scoring functions, a whole bunch of other stuff that gets called, and eventually it gets to yours as well to say, where is it? This is where my startup listener is called. And then it does the config dump, which it does to say, all right, everything is done now. This is what I'm executing, and this is why you're getting the config dump. And when the config dump is done, it starts with iteration 0. Right? Happy? So now, when you work in this way, you actually start realizing, okay, but when do I want this to happen, for example? So in the vehicle band stuff, when do I want to create or read in my vehicles, for example, or create new vehicles, or assign them IDs or attributes, so that you know where you can actually do that. But in order to understand, now we still have code that's running. We haven't messed up anything. MATSim still runs from start to end without any errors. Right, and now I need to check something which I haven't done yet. So let's just go to, I haven't done IntelliJ yet. So I want to go to Startup Listener, and I want to ultimately go to Controller Listener. And if I'm not mistaken, if I click, at least on the Mac, Apple B, it takes me to the Controller Listener, to where it's actually created. If I press Control B again, yeah, you see it doesn't do that.
Completed training because of that.
Okay, so what I want is, I want to know what are possible instantiations of this thing called a controller listener? I know it extends an event listener or a MATSim extension point, and there's the ultimate thing, kind of a MATSim extension point. But these controller listeners, what are they? And this is where I need to check, find usages. Okay, but it's not usage because it's not used. And in Eclipse, it's called the type hierarchy. So you get the different types. Is there code? Type. There you go. Control H. Let's see what that does. Control H. There it is. And there's the list of all my controller listeners. There's a plans dumping, plan scoring, scoring listener, startup listener, iteration starts listener, before MATSim, replanning listener, after MATSim, events handling, shutdown, and a whole bunch of different things. So just for the next few minutes, let's just implement an iteration starts listener. Let's say you want to write some iterations or the state of your simulation model at the start of every iteration. And let's do a shutdown listener.
So it's basically configuring settings before we even start with the simulation.
Well, these are hook points that we can, similar to what we've done now. Remember, we've created an all my controller listener, and we implemented a startup listener. So
that one was before.
Exactly. So the startup listener is at a specific place in the MATSim washing machine at startup.
So we can add a listener
exactly.
after scoring.
Exactly.
Before. Okay.
Correct. And inside that, you can put whatever code, you can manipulate it, you can do whatever you actually want in here. Right, so let's do let's implement here, because that's why I called this class all my controller listeners, because I can do it in one place. Startup listener, comma, start. Where's the events start of iteration thingy? Before iteration, there you go. So if I click that, iteration starts listener, immediately it says, whoops, there's an error. It wants me to implement the methods. And similar to the notify startup, there's a method that must be implemented, notify iteration starts, and I put in my same log message, log.warn. This is called at the start of every iteration. Save this. I don't have to change anything else. All of my controller listeners are bound to the controller, so I should be able to just run it. MATSim is still running. Oops, here at the bottom. And if I now kind of scroll up, I should at the start of every iteration, there it is. So there you can actually read the log message, calling notify iteration start, so you can see what calls it. So the leg histogram listener calls the iteration startup or iteration starts listener, the link stats controller listener, the all my controller listeners, and there's my message. Right, at the start of the next iteration, there it is again. Right, and this iteration starts event, I can actually get some information from it. If I call that thing iteration starts event dot, I can get the services, which are all of the controller, this whole kind of washing machine that comes along with it, or I can just get the iteration number. So let's just get the iteration number. It is an integer, and we say here start of iteration plus, and I give it that value. Let's see if that runs. No, there's an error. I need a semicolon. And there it is. So the event actually carries a whole bunch of stuff with it that you can get your hands on as well. Right, finally, let's call the shutdown listener. It wants another method. And we will just add one more log message that says log.warn ready to shut down, calculate final statistics. You do your magic in the rest of this method. You write the files, read whatever you want to do, and the whole bunch of stuff actually still runs. And there it actually is, ready to shut down, calculated. There are a couple of other classes that actually do this as well, that calls these listeners. And this kind of machinery is available to you, and I think one should learn how to use it inside MATSim to just make your life a lot easier. So that
for the VIP group specifically, so we teach them this way to calculate the final statistics, because that's going to be tutorial 4 that I now need to work on.
Yeah.
Should I do it this way? A private module that has got the controller listener, and then at that point calculates the final statistics.
because otherwise what happens is we end up with two runs. We have a MATSim run, and then we have our own independent Java class that goes and reads that all the text files, reads it in, and you actually have it available here.
Okay.
I want to get to a point of these one-click runs, so that when you run the MATSim class, it actually does all of the analysis and the reading and writing and stuff for you as well. Okay, so the one last thing is you may, for example, want to have or want to know something about the final plans that were selected. All right, so right in the end, the last iteration, what was the final plans? Let's say you want to get those scores of the final plans. For that you need the scenario. And there's no scenario in here. But I want to calculate, let's just add a, calculate something from population. And this is where the inject really becomes pretty useful. So what I'm saying, and I can do this inside a controller listener, I can't do this at the module, because by the time that the module is created, you don't know anything about the scenario necessarily, because the controller and everything has not been instantiated. But by the time that the washing machine is switched on, the scenario is intact. So with all of these listeners, it is available. So I say at inject, and I use the Google inject, not the Java X inject. So I inject the scenario, and I'm going to call the scenario just lowercase sc. And that plug means probably pluck it from thin air. Wherever it is, the cool thing is the scenario has been created with a probably scenario implementation. Whoa, no? What was that? Control H. There's the mutable scenario. Somewhere in here there will probably be something associated with the Google inject function that tells you you can inject this thing if you need it elsewhere. I don't know what that would actually look like. Okay, so let's skip that. Suffice to say that you can just say inject the scenario, I want it here, I don't care where you get it from, pluck it from thin air. And then suddenly what we can do here is we can say for each person called person, n sc dot get population dot get persons dot values. Let's just add a counter here. Int counter is 0. Counter, increment the counter, and in the end write out how many people there were. Log.warn, oops, found plus counter people. Right, so you can do something in there. Now granted, our MATSim run as it is doesn't have a population, so I expect that this should still be 0. But at least it should not crash. Yes?
So you just start with some scenario.
You just say inject the scenario. Like you would say final, or you would say public scenario sc equals new, or you call it from somewhere. Just as you define a public or a private variable, here you just say inject. So we define it, we say that sc is of type scenario, but we just say get it from somewhere. It'll get it automatically. So all I'm doing is I could have just called getPersons.size if I want to, but just for the sake of argument, let's just cycle through all of the people and see whether we actually find something. Right. And this should actually run and right in the end tell us that there are 0 people. And there it is, found 0 people. But it's running, it's not crashing. And I think that's the important thing, is you should have code that runs all of the time from day one. Yep, thank you. Right, so if you want to go and play around, start adding, initially when you start thinking about these things, write your code so that it runs. If you have an optimization algorithm, write the code so that it iteratively just runs and say, I'm iteration 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But other than that, it does nothing. Just to get that functionality going. Yep. And understand logically that the thing is running. Then you add a little bit of detail. Is this kind of doing what it's supposed to do? Write a unit test for that new method that you've actually done. The unit test pass, your code still runs. Good. Eventually, if you have a piece of code that actually runs, you write an integration test. Run that entire experiment for me and check that there are 25 people and that person number 23 has a selected plan with score 250 or whatever it is. And every time come hell or high water, the integration test must run and get to 250 for person number 23. Otherwise, something is broken. Or you need to update your integration test of some sort.
So can you quickly just open the run MATSimLogs class again? Just go down to add that.
And let me just clean up that, optimize imports. Okay.